pixels or mesh point clouds of these sequences, and then the outputs would be these part stable decompositions over time, where we know what shape that part roughly has and how that part moves over time with respect to the body frame of reference. And the key assumption we're going to make is that those parts rotate and translate about some body frame of reference. So why do we care about this? Well, in my work, I'm interested in enabling scalable scientific studies and experiments, and part of that is being able to discover structure in data, especially when we don't have a complete model of system dynamics. And so if we have some assumptions that we can make, then some structure will fall out of those assumptions. So in this case, if we have a parts model, if we think that parts rotate and translate, they articulate about some set of joints, then we can make that assumption, find structure in the data, and then be able to do things like automate experiment designs by automatically scheduling interventions when some conditions are met during the middle of that experiment. So an example of this kind of work is we wanted to ask what differences exist, statistically speaking, in the social interactions between pairs of monkeys, where in one pair, they have a gene that's associated, that we think might be associated with autism. They have that gene expressed, and in the other pair, neither monkey has that gene. And so what we're going to do is we're going to record dozens of hours of data. That data looks a bit like this. So you have monkeys moving around, and you can see that we're tracking them here. We don't really have parts models. You can see these ellipses kind of cover the extents of the bodies, but they're not very stable over time because this was earlier tracking work that I've done. And what we want to do is, given this tracking data over long periods of time, ask what are the differences between these two pairs of monkeys under repeated trials. And what we're able to show was that the monkeys that had the gene that we thought might be associated with autism, we found that they had reduced environment exploration, reduced reciprocal play, reduced socializing with each other, and reduced vocalizations. And these are the kinds of behaviors that we see in autism in humans. And so we're able to publish that in Nature on the first evidence for primate animal models for autism research. So back to parts modeling, how can we, part of the goal here is let's take that kind of tracking that I just showed and now make it so that we can figure out a finer grain, not just location of the animals over time and how their body roughly extends over time, but also figure out parts like head, body, and tail without assuming that there's a head, body, or tail. So the existing work in this space is large, and a lot of it going back from cardboard people to Felsenschwab's deformable parts models to real-time connect pose tracking. A lot of it is concerned with strong discriminative performance. So we have some existing body model or joint model, and we want to take a large amount of training data, fit the parameters, and then go use that for detection or tracking in real time. Another bit of work has these much finer grained 3D models of either quadrupedal animals, such as from Sylvia Zuppi and Michael Black's work, or Mahmoud and others, where they have multi-camera setups. So you might have a couple dozen cameras, and the target, such as a human, is painted with special dyes or markers, and then you want to fit their pose, the pose of them, like if they're dancing, to some template mesh and see and figure out, a very fine-grained representation of their body pose over time. Our method's different in that we don't assume a body model in advance, and we don't have a large set of training data to take advantage of because we want to just be able to learn structure from short observation sequences. So how do we build a generative parts model? Let's start with the linear Gaussian case where we don't have any rotation and translation. We only have translation, so there's no articulation in the parts, but we're going to use these linear Gaussian dynamics to build up intuition and then switch out from a Euclidean space to this space on Lie groups or manifolds. So if we have some body frame X at time t, we can have that evolve smoothly with just random Gaussian dynamics with these innovations Q sub t. We can then have parts be generated about that body frame of reference. So the kth part at time t is theta tk. And those are also random innovations in the body frame of reference. But the problem is you can see that these little diamonds, these parts, they can wander arbitrarily far away from the body frame of reference. And we don't want that because in a parts model, the parts generally stay relatively close to the body, even if they can move smoothly. We go on a little tangent here and talk about a biased random walk. Suppose that you have a stochastic process where at time 0, theta naught is equal to 0, and at time t you have this root a theta t minus 1 plus square root 1 minus a of some random noise. If we ask what's the expected value of that, well, that's 0 at time t. And if we ask what the variance is, well, we have this recursive decomposition here. And what that looks like at time 1 is this sigma squared 1 minus a. And at time 2, it's sigma squared 1 minus a times a factor a plus 1. And more generally, at time t, we have this sigma squared 1 minus a times a geometric series. And that geometric series converges for any a that has absolute value less than 1. So in particular, what this shows is that the variance of this stochastic process is equal to sigma squared, which is exactly the sigma squared that we chose for the random innovations. Why is this useful? Well, now we can have parts that evolve smoothly around some zero mean, but they have a bounded variance. So in one dimension, that looks like this, where the gray dotted line is the mean, and then the red lines are the plus minus 3 sigma. So if we go back to our generative parts model, now we've stabilized the theta tks about some new part called omega k. So that's the canonical part. You can think of it as like the average location of a part over all time. So like your left arm, for instance, tends to hang from your left shoulder, even if it can rotate and translate to be in different kinds of positions. And so these omega k's, they're just some random innovation in the body frame of reference. And then the parts at time t, theta tk, they're just smooth motions about their canonical part frame of reference, so the omega k's. Then, of course, we don't generally get to observe a body or parts directly. We have some observation models, so these y's in this simple linear Gaussian case are these observations that fall off of the composition of the body xt, the canonical part k location, the per time part location theta tk, and then some random noise epsilon tk. So this is fine as a generative parts model, but the problem is that parts don't just translate in this Euclidean space, they articulate. And so we want to go from these linear Gaussian settings to a nonlinear manifold setting where instead of having just random Gaussian innovation on R2 or R3, we're going to be doing random innovations on the space of all rotations and translations. So for that, we're going to impose Lie group dynamics on how the body and the parts move over time. And then we're going to deal with not knowing how there's an unknown number of parts in advance using a Dirichlet process. So in particular, the Lie group that we care about, we signify as this capital G in the right here, and elements of capital GX are specifically belong to either SE2 or SE3, depending on whether our observation model is 2D or 3D. We're going to define this left invariant concentrated Gaussian, which is effectively a Gaussian distribution with support on this Lie group, this space of rotations and translations. And that distribution is going to have draws that look like these frames of reference in 2D on the left and 3D on the right here, which also act as transformations from one coordinate system to another. So why can't we just directly put distributions on, say, the elements of a rotation and translation matrix? Well, the problem is that these Lie groups don't form a vector space. So if we just, for instance, use additive noise, we're going to fall out of the Lie group. So we're no longer going to have a valid rotation and translation pair. But what we can do is work with local linear approximations about elements of the Lie group. So if you have this element mu on the circle, which is the space of 2D rotations, then you can talk about mapping to and from a local linear approximation of that element mu using the blue exponential map with the blue arrow that goes from the tangent space to the group, to the manifold, and then the logarithmic map in green that goes from the group back to the tangent space or the local linear approximation. So what is a Lie group? Well, it's just a smooth, continuous, a smooth manifold that is also sort of a continuous group, and continuous here just means it has some set of real parameters that describe its configuration space. being a group, there's some binary operator that satisfies closure, identity, associativity, and the existence of an inverse. There's a whole bunch of Lie groups out there, but the one that we care about is the general linear group. So these can be represented, elements of this manifold, this Lie group, can be represented as n by n invertible matrices with real entries. So in particular, the space that we're working with is SE2 or SE3, and that has special structure that most of you should be familiar with. So if you have an element B, then it can be expressed as a block matrix with some rotation submatrix R sub B and a translation vector D sub B in rows of zeros and ones that allow you to work on homogeneous points. The inverse of an element of SE2 or SE3 is defined in terms of these rotation and translation vectors as expressed here on the right. And then the binary operator for this Lie group is simply matrix multiplication. So if you compose two elements, B and C, then you get another rotation matrix in the upper left corner and a translation vector in the upper right corner of this BC matrix. So what we need to do is talk about tangent spaces. In particular, these are these local linear approximations about the neighborhood of some element in the Lie group. And once we have this tangent space, then we can stick any normal linear vector space sort of style distribution in that tangent space and work with that and map to and from the tangent space to get distributions over the manifold. So the logarithmic and exponential map in the case of matrix Lie groups, such as SE2 and SE3, have these expressions here where log of the matrix element A, so these are, the rotation, A has a rotation submatrix and a translation subvector. These are just defined in terms of the matrix logarithmic map, which is well defined for any set of matrices A such that A minus I has a norm less than 1, which this is actually technically only working on the rotation matrix submatrix part of this element, so it's defined in all cases. And then the exponential map is just this matrix exponential, which is exponential series, which converges for all complex entries X. So that gives us a way to map to and from what's called the Lie algebra that's associated with the Lie group. And the Lie algebra is defined about the identity element of the Lie group. So the identity element for SE2 or SE3 is the element that has no rotation and no translation. And we can roughly define the Lie algebra as the set of all X such that the exponential map of that X times some real parameter is an element of the Lie group. And in particular, the Lie algebra forms a vector space, and it has these generators. In the case of SE2, G1 through 3, you can think of the generators as basis vectors. Even though they're matrices, we work with them as though they're basis vectors because there's a one-to-one map between this matrix representation and a vector representation. And so any element of the Lie algebra, remember this linear space, V, is just linear combinations of these generators where you can think of G1 as the X translation, G2 as the Y translation, and G3 as the rotation in 2D. If we're working with SE3, there's 6 generators, one for each of the translations in 3 dimensions and one for each of the 3 rotations. And then linear combinations, the exponential map for these elements V of the Lie algebra just have this simple form here, which should look familiar for people who've worked with rotation matrices in 2D. And that's just showing that there's a closed form formula for those exponential maps that, and also logarithmic maps that although they're infinite series, end up converging in the case of these particular groups and algebras. So we have a Lie algebra about the identity element, this map, the little g. And what we need to do is talk about making a tangent space about any element, a local linear approximation about any element, not just the identity element. And the way that we do that is we're going to define the tangent space in terms of the Lie algebra about the identity element. So in particular, we can define these logarithmic map with respect to some element mu, or the exponential map with respect to some element mu. As in the logarithm case, we're just going to translate by the inverse of mu, that gets us to the identity element, and then take the Lie group logarithmic map, which takes us to the Lie algebra. And then in the exponential map case, we're going to take the exponential of some vector in the linear space, the Lie algebra, and then translate by the mu element to get to a linear space about the element mu. So that allows us to have a local linear approximation about any element and to map to and from the group and the local space about that group, the local approximation that's linear in a vector space about that group. Now, to have a distribution on the tangent space about any element of the group, we need to have a Riemannian metric, so some notion of distance. And the Riemannian metric here, it's an inner product on vectors of the tangent space defined in the neighborhood of some element mu. So that's just this quadratic form here, U transpose QV, where Q is some symmetric positive definite matrix. There's some issues on how to define that matrix. I'm going to skip over for the sake of time, but basically in our model, we have a prior on that matrix, an inverse Wishart prior that allows us to infer that rather than having to trade off the specific translation and rotation, how each contributes to the distance of two elements on the group. Okay, and then the last thing is we need some notion of expected value and covariance. In the case of manifolds, you can define the expected value of k elements on the group, so these are SE2 or SE3 elements, as the minimizing mu, that the thing that minimizes the sum of the distances of those elements to that mu. And the key thing is in most cases for Lie groups and manifolds, there's only local minimizers, so those are called Karcher means. In some cases, there's a global minimizer, which is a Frechette mean. In our case, we're only concerned with Karcher means. And then covariances of a collection of group elements are just defined as the standard outer product for covariances, but in terms of the tangent vectors after you've done this Riemannian logarithmic map. So putting all of that together, we can define this left invariant concentrated Gaussian as just a standard multivariate Gaussian where you take X and mu are elements of the Lie group, so they have a rotation submatrix and translation vector. They're represented as matrices. You take this Riemannian logarithmic map, you get to the tangent space about mu, and then you can just use the multivariate Gaussian inside that tangent space, where the covariance sigma can be interpreted as a covariance in that vector space, that tangent space. And then a key property that we care about is that the action of SE2 or SE3 on a homogeneous point, say P, if you have P here that has coordinates X and Y and a homogeneous one, and that P is defined in terms of a relative coordinate system of some part. So here, suppose it's defined in the theta T3 part system, and that the theta T3 part system is defined in the omega 3 system, which is defined in the X system, which is defined in the world system W, then given the part coordinates in the part system, P, we can get the coordinates in the world system by just doing this composition of the world coordinate frame, the body coordinate frame X, the canonical part frame omega 3, and then the per time part frame theta T3. And so why this matters for us is that we're going to be observing a bunch of points on an object in world coordinates and wanting to do inference on those points in the relative part coordinate frames. So does this point belong to the left arm or the right arm or the left leg, for instance? So what does that look like? Well, if we have this world coordinate frame in 3D on the far right, then we have some object that exists in that world coordinate frame with a body frame of reference xt, and around that xt it has some number of parts, and for instance, the yellow part, which is the left arm, has a canonical location omega 3 and then a per time transformation theta tk, or omega k and theta tk. So that arm can rotate and translate about the omega, the typical location. So he can wave, he can move it up and down and walk and run and do those sorts of motions. But it's all well described by this sort of composition of world, body, and canonical part and per time part transformations, all of which are just SE3 transformations. So going back to the parts model, the generative model, this was the linear Gaussian case, and all we're going to do is take the x's, thetas, and omegas and put them, instead of a Euclidean space, put them into the Lie group space, SE3 or SE2, and we're going to change out these additions for matrix multiplications. So what that looks like, is this expression here. So you can see like xt is still a random walk, but now it's a random walk on the space of rotations and translations. Theta tk is a little more complicated because the rotations are a random walk, whereas the translations are these stabilized random walks that we talked about so that they can't wander too far off, so the arms don't fly off, for instance. And then the nth observation at time t, ytn, that's just the composition of the body frame of reference xt, and then the canonical part omega k, the per time part theta tk, and then some random noise epsilon. And then a graphical model for this with most of the prior distributions, these h sub q, h sub x, and so on, is described here, where the only thing we're updating is the prior and the arrows for the omega k's, just because it would complicate the model quite a bit to show that. Key thing for inference is that because we have a Gaussian observation model and this left invariant concentrated Gaussian dynamics model on the space of rotations and translations, we get these closed form translation conditionals when we do Gibbs sampling. So if we want to infer the translation of a given part or a given object at time t given all of the other values, we can do that in a closed form that ends up just being a Gaussian distribution that can be analytically computed. And then for rotation sampling, we need to use slice sampling, which is a Metropolis-Hastings algorithm. But the nice thing is that rotation angles have this bounded domain, so we can do that fairly efficiently. And then there's some tricks in the paper that I won't get into here where we have to look at a number of modes that exist because the observation model is sort of not unique between those modes, but we know what they are and we can do that pretty easily. Okay, so that's details on the Lie group dynamics, and then I'm going to just briefly jump through Dirichlet processes and then get to results so that we have time for some questions. So the Dirichlet process is, you can think of it as an infinite mixture model. I'm going to speed up here just so we have time for questions. But basically, if you have a collection of observations and you don't know what the number of clusters are in advance, you can put a prior belief, which is this Dirichlet process, and it will allow you to specify some base distribution, where here the base distribution is Gaussian, and then with using some inference, you can figure out how many roughly Gaussian clusters there are. In our case, the base distribution isn't a Gaussian, but it's actually the body, the part transformations over all time plus the prior distributions for all of the dynamics for each part. So if you have 3 time steps in this toy problem here, then you can see that it proposes a certain number of parts, initially starting to be too many parts, but eventually gets 3 parts, and it shows their rotation and translation in 2D, and it picks that up pretty well. Okay, so that's the Dirichlet process, and then I'll just now jump into results, and we can get to questions. So back to, we want to be able to sort of discover part structure from short sequences of objects articulating objects in motion. On the far left, we have the original video in 2D, or 2.5D in some cases, or mesh data. And in the middle, we have what our method infers, and then we have a nonparametric baseline on the right. And you can see that the legs are well segmented with our method compared to the other, the baseline where legs are switching over time and new parts are being generated. The hand is even more stable. You can see that each of the fingers are well separated. The wrist is well separated. This is monkey data with a depth sensor, and you can see that the tail is well separated from the body. These are some quantitative metrics, multi-object tracking and segmentation metrics that we repurpose here for determining how well we pick up different parts of an object that were human annotated, and then how stable those parts are over time. So, clearly segmenting an object into parts is a ambiguous task. Different people could say there's different parts. But what we're really interested in here is how stable are those parts over time once they're inferred. And so these metrics, especially the identity switches in the left column, are useful for showing that our method outperforms the nonparametric baseline. And it also outperforms the parametric baseline that gets to cheat and know the true number of parts, but doesn't know doesn't get to use Lie group dynamics. So effectively, these conditions form an ablation study, where you either have known or unknown number of parts and then Lie group dynamics or not. And then some additional results. This is on mesh, a sequence of mesh data points. A key thing here is that our observation model assumes that points on like the arm or the leg, for instance, are Gaussian distributed about the mean location of that part. With mesh data, you're only getting observations on the surface of the mesh. So what we need to do if we have mesh data is we just sample points on the interior of the mesh, which can be done as a pre-processing step, and then you can run the algorithm as needed. One thing to note here is that the legs get segmented into 2 parts each, whereas the arms are only 1 part each. And part of the reason for that is that the arms are not articulating at the elbow, whereas the knees are articulating at the knees. The legs are articulating at the knees. We've been able to demonstrate generalization across data sets. So if you have a monkey in one video and then a different monkey in a different video, then we see that the tail and body separation that's learned in one video transfers to the other. We can do sampling of new sampling from this generative model. That's not perfect, but it's okay. So if this is the original video, then we can sample new body transformations easily. And then the harder thing is sampling new parts transformations. So this is what that looks like. You can see that it still looks roughly spider-like, but there's some like baton twirling kind of effects on the front legs there. So it's not perfect, and that's partly an issue with identity switches in the legs from the original inference. We can re-render videos or observation sequences in an arbitrary coordinate system of any of the parts. So for instance, the original on the left, we re-render it in the coordinate frame of the thumb. And we can do some new applications like part-aware motion segmentation, where without knowing what any of the parts are or that this is a spider, we know that the legs are engaging in much more motion in the body frame of reference than the thorax or abdomen parts of the body are. So we can segment those out. We get some shape and configuration posterior. So these dotted lines are sort of the rough shape of each part. And then the solid ellipses are the kinds of motions that they undergo. So you can see that the fingers are undergoing very little motion, whereas the spider, the legs are undergoing a very large amount of motion. And then more speculatively, we can do some motion analysis. We'd like to be able to do motion analysis. So imagine you have a double pendulum here. Our method can pick up that there's 2 parts and that they're swinging, rotating and translating in a certain way. And what we'd like to do is, if that's the kind of structure that we can discover in data, and maybe we have a better dynamics model for a double pendulum, then we can swap that dynamics model in, given that we've built up enough evidence for it. And then we can also use it in multi-object tracking, where you can have these monkeys moving over time, and then you can see what parts are visible at a given time or not, if they're occluded under these shells, for instance. Okay, so some future directions. We'd like to incorporate higher order motion models, so acceleration and jerk, but with the Lie group dynamics that involves some more complicated machinery. We'd like to do nonlinear observation models and manifold valued weights, so that we don't have just this Gaussian observation model where parts are sort of ellipsoidal, encouraged to be ellipsoidal, but they could be, more complicated. So for that, there's these structured variational autoencoders that allow you to combine Bayesian graphical models with neural networks. And then we'd like to work on, improving the samplers to like Riemannian HMC, Hamiltonian Monte Carlo, and also looking at other manifolds such as working with manifolds such as the manifold of positive definite matrices, which would allow us to put different distributions on, say, a covariance matrix. So if we wanted a prior distribution on a covariance matrix, we wouldn't have to be restricted by the current distributions that exist for that, like the inverse Wishart. And then finally, possibly combined with finer grained models, such as the smaller models, the scape models, and other more involved 3D models like that. Such as the ones that Henry is about to talk about. This is some further reading on the topic, some books, and then some papers. This first paper is particularly useful as a very accessible introduction, this Ethan Eade paper. And then with that, I'll conclude and take any questions.